It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And I just said to Bishop Stephen, have you been having a good time? He said, it's been absolutely tremendous. I said, I'll soon put a stop to that for you. But let's go. I feel a fraud. Many of you here are local ministers. You work in local contexts. You've got real live congregations in front of you. I was in my last parish appointment. Well, let me exaggerate a little bit, when Doe Craig Wilde was young. And it's a long time ago. Sorry, Doe, couldn't resist it. But no, 1990s, early 1990s, and since then I've been a chaplain, a lecturer, a college principal, and now a leader of a central staff of about 170 Methodists and swanning around places, banging the drum for this, that and the other. A fraud then, because I haven't had a congregation to look at for 20-odd years, though I'll revert to that this September. A fraud because in the last 10 years, British Methodism, which is absolutely assiduous, perhaps even obsessed with collecting information about itself, has lost a third of its members, half of its young adults and people, and 1,000 of its churches, which leads you to believe instantly that this is a kind of if you can't do it, teach it session this afternoon about discipleship. There's another narrative I could tell you. Over the past 4 years, about 1/3 of 5,000 Methodist churches in the UK have started either a new act of worship, a new service of ministry, or started a fresh expression. 2/5 of Methodist churches have made more new members than they've lost. But the demography of a church like Contemporary Methodism means that we would have to triple that and a bit more just to meet up with the death rate. There are, proportionate to our size, more people training to be local preachers in the Methodist Church now than there has been since 1973. But I still feel a fraud. So don't think that I'm going to say this afternoon anything that you don't already know. But I need to let you into secret that I've got a mission this afternoon. And if you forget all else, I want you to remember the mission, and you surely will forget all else. What I really want to do this afternoon is to encourage you to take ever more seriously what we already know, and we know lots, more than we know, and take heart and take faith and be increasingly courageous about implementing what you know, because it takes guts and it takes faith and it takes resolve to implement what we know about discipleship and church growth. And if one or two people take heart in that and say, yes, I will, then all the technical stuff, if there is any technical stuff, can wait. The final bit about an introduction about a fraud is perhaps not quite so much a fraud. Every week I do 3 things. I do a lot more than 3 things, but every week I do 3 things. One is that I've done relatively recently is take the shopping order to my 93 and 91-year-old father and mother, and while I'm there invariably put the rubbish out, change a light bulb, take the water out the dehumidifier, and sit down and have a conversation which astonishingly resembles the conversation that you had last week and the week before. They are devout Christian people, and they belong to a generation who we have used and relied upon, and in some senses abused as clergy. And they had 3 sons. One died, and the second telephone call I make is to my younger brother, who had exactly the same upbringing I had, got sent to the same Sunday school I did, and has not darkened the door of a church or anything Christian for the last 35 years, apart from my son's marriage, which is the 3rd telephone call I make each week, to somebody who doesn't go regularly to any sort of church that most people in this room would recognise, but works for Christian Aid, is absolutely passionate about justice and world peace and ecology, and turns to me as a Methodist minister and says, I understand what you do, Dad. It just doesn't affect or scratch anything that makes sense in my life. And this is somebody who claims to follow Christ. So 3 phone calls. So if you can identify with any of those things, let's just say that neither intellectually nor in terms of pastoral experience in recent times, I might be a fraud. In terms of a human being who's surrounded by both the legacy of, the fruits of, and the past and the present of, why we need to grasp life-changing, world-transforming discipleship as a key theme of the church. I live with it every day, and I'm sure you do too. Christine asked me to focus on how do we disciple people in our churches, and what I've done this afternoon in the time I've got is select themes that I think are significant. I've recognised that you've had great biblical input from other people, that you're receiving guests who live in a different sort of our real world. And forgive me if I get it wrong, because it's always difficult to drop in like Planet Zod from somewhere in the middle of a conference and do something and go away again. And so if I go in the wrong direction or I don't do what you asked me to do, it's the spirit's willing, it's just the mind that's a bit weak. I do need a launching point though, and my launching point would be the Great Commission. Did Paula refer to the Great Commission?
Yes.
Briefly, yeah. You know the Great Commission. Go into all the world, baptizing people in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to everything I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always to the end of the earth. No, go and make disciples. I want to remind you it's a commission for all, and I want to remind you why I need to remind us of that. The early disciples on the hillside by Jesus receiving this original command heard that, and for the first 400 years of the church, every major father who wrote about the history of the church agreed that that was a limited commission. It was to the disciples around Jesus, and when the last one died, then effectively the commission was either fulfilled or ended. And that went on all the way through the vast majority of Christian history. You don't find, for instance, if you look at Calvin or Luther or Zwingli, any great appreciation that Matthew chapter 28 has anything to do with the commission for them. It's historic, it's gone. And it's not known, that passage, as the Great Commission at all. Not until around about the 17th century. And let me just give you a little romantic story here, and I'll move to the application in a minute. John Wesley, that good Anglican, died in March 1791. When he died, he'd spent a lot of time travelling around Britain. And within months of his death, there was a young man, a cobbler, who went before a group of elders. A year later would become known as the Baptist Missionary Society. And this Baptist cobbler had written this tract, the first draft of which was written in the week that John Wesley died, though to my knowledge they didn't know one another. It had the snappy title of something like "The Consideration of the Propagation of the Gospel to Heathens," and that's the short version. And William Carey, for who it was, is reported to have gone to these elders with the claim, because it's in chapter 1 of that pamphlet, in print now, that the Great Commission needed to be received as a commission to us all. And apparently John Ryland stood up and said those famous words, "Sit down, young man. If God wants to convert the heathen, he'll do it without help of you or I." And you have there in two images that great Arminian thing that John Wesley was absolutely hot about, and that transforming Calvinist thing that Carey is beginning to live through, about who's included and where the all is. John Wesley was absolutely convinced when he preached from the Great Commission that he was preaching to people who needed to respond to it and take it up. And that's exactly where, from the late 17th, early 18th century, most Christianity went. Now, I remind you of that history Because the idea that the Great Commission is for us all today, all of us, is still deeply misunderstood. It's misunderstood in two ways, and let me just put a little caveat in what I'm saying now. I'll speak for the Methodist Church because I know that the Church of England is so much better and grander and more informed and has none of the kind of people and foibles that I'm referring to this afternoon. That's my get-out clause. But if at all anything that I say about Methodist people today and the relationship between the clergy and the laity strikes any chord at all, well, what a coincidence. So in Methodism, there's a false understanding of what it means to be a church member nowadays in terms of discipleship. We've reduced it to membership or belonging, and most of the time we treat, whether we intend to do or not, our laity as those who turn up, pay up, and preferably shut up. We as clergy have largely colluded with this myth that discipleship is essentially expressed by commitment to the church, by taking up roles and offices, by being faithful in attendance at worship, and if you're really good, turning up at the jumble sales or Saturday fairs. And so we have colluded for decades and decades with a reductionist, fragmented version of discipleship. For those long schooled in it, like my parents, those who have faithfully played the game and excelled in that kind of discipleship, we have clearly succeeded. The problem is, by any notion whatsoever, we are succeeding with fewer and fewer people. For new generations, who just as much as their forebears, I believe, are being wooed by the prevenient work of God, the Holy Spirit, the go-between God, such discipleship resembles the comment from my Christian, quote-unquote, middle son. I get what you're saying, Dad, but your version of church and living as a Christian doesn't have the calories to produce the energy that produces something that I want to give my life to. Leave me alone and let me write this blog today about how the EC needs to deal and get its act together regarding asylum seekers being sunk on the Mediterranean. That's where it's at. So much church produces and seems designed to produce what you might call discipleship light. And as clergy, whether we don't feel ourselves personally responsible for it, we must at least participate in the situation that that's the reality in so many of our churches. And just while I'm going here, I'm not critical of people in this. You'll see where I'm going. The younger generation, by which I mean people like me, under 60, at least for another 9 days, have been educated to believe that anything worthwhile is turn up, pay up and shut up. But secondly, there's that misunderstanding that we've got to note when we say the Great Commission is for all, is that if disciples are found inside the church, the job of actually making disciples lies with somebody else. It's not them and it's not their job. Whatever it is you're meant to be, they've become it. Wherever it is you're meant to be located, they've arrived in it. And the job of actually liaising with anything outside that must surely be somebody else's job. It's usually you, the priests, the ministers. That's what you're trained for. That's what we pay you for. That's usually said sotto voce. And so sometimes, as clergy, we respond by trying to do more of what we think that would consist of. Or sometimes we outsource, which is always good in a modern era, by a missioner or a youth worker, get somebody trained. But in some senses, even though our youth work might improve, or our sense of mission in local community improve, both of which are good, what we've effectively done is allow the normal congregation in our churches to continue to believe that discipleship happens somewhere else and involves somebody else other than them. Except, and I say this as a one-time theological educator, that we don't actually, at least in the Methodist Church, largely train clergy for that role. And we spent the last 4 years very, very painfully asking the question, are we actually training people for ordination to serve in a church that we actually recognise needs those kind of people? We train them largely to collude with a mutually disempowering agreement that disciples are in the church and are therefore cared for by the shepherd and the pastor, the reflective practitioner, the decently trained theologian, the expert in running Christendom Christianity. When I was writing a book, several books back, this one, here's some evidence for this. Several thousand American Methodist lay people illustrate this point. Participants were asked to choose one option from the following list that best described their understanding. Lay people are: A, members of the church, people of God, called to a total ministry of witness and service in the world. B, people who are ministered to by the clergy, who are the true church. C, people in part-time Christian service. D, non-ordained Christians whose function is to help the clergy do the work of the church. Almost 60% chose the last option. Similarly, while commenting about the results of a questionnaire circulated among local churches about their expectations of ordained ministry, a report dated 2006 said this. This is, again, is Methodist, so you won't recognise it. The main aim seems to be to maintain a certain number of ministers. There's nothing about worship and mission. There's not even the suggestion that the people need ministers to help them as they engage in worship and mission. When asked what sort of ministers they want, they tend to say an all-rounder. They seem to think that the people exist to maintain the ministers, and the ministers just exist to do everything for the people. It's as if the minister is a sort of church butler who ensures that all the household jobs get done and that everyone's need is catered for, while the church family take their leisure or indulge in whatever takes their fancy. Well, I overstate a case, or do I, to make it? I don't blame either group, neither clergy nor laity. It must be terribly hard to say to my nonagenarian parents, you've been faithful inhabiting this model of laity all your lives, but now we want you to be something else because we've got our act together about what the church ought to be. But in whatever patient pastoral way, what we've got to go through is a culture shift. So how do we make disciples today? I'll go back there. Well, in partnership with a new understanding and appreciation of laity, a new understanding of ordained roles, a deliberate dismantling of a mutually disempowering collusion between an older model of laity and an older model of clergy, by looking carefully at who we are training to be what, to do what, among whom, in every context, by deliberately and intentionally pursuing a cultural change about what being a Christian is about, and repeating and repeating coherent themes coming out of the parish council or the leaders' meeting, and the dogged and resilient focus on certain activities and spiritual themes repeated over a long period of time. And for us as individuals, as clergy, the costly repeated choices to facilitate discipleship as a major and a key component of what it is to be ordained. The deepening of discipleship, the making of new disciples, is an indispensable aspect of contemporary clergy. Which means that we make hard choices about what we will focus upon, what flack we're willing to take, and the decision to put it through the litmus paper test: is this discipleship facilitating? And just in passing, I note that those local churches, this is Methodism again, those local churches who have those new to faith within it find it much easier to begin to embark in the culture shift. It's very difficult when everybody currently in a congregation are well established there and agree together what they are is what they should be. And so the first thing to break the vicious circle is to introduce our godly, settled people to a bunch of people who are completely unlike them and new to faith, even if it only lasts 6 weeks. I'll never forget that somebody joined a prayer group I was a member of some time ago and became a Christian through the ministry of one of the people belonging to the prayer group, and invited Andrew along. And Andrew materialised, looked absolutely perfectly ordinary. First prayer meeting he'd ever done, and I will use his language, though it's not language I normally use, because you know what's coming. He offered the first prayer out loud in a prayer meeting of 8 people. Lord, thank you for saving me. I've just got to say to you that this Christianity is fucking brilliant. And there was this long pause, and everybody in the prayer circle nodded sagely and said, Amen. But something happens to these sagely, somewhat staid, somewhat frustrating, godly people when they're surrounded by the need and the opportunity of somebody who's not like them. I'm going off piste here, but let me tell you another story, because stories work best. When I was in Shetland, I stayed for 4 days with an old couple in the early 70s called Zena and Donald. I've got their permission to use their real names. It was an interesting trip because I was there for 4 full days, but only on the last day did any of my clothes turn up. They'd all gone to Fair Isle. And I stayed with this couple, and we went to Lerwick, and the first time they took us through Lerwick, which is about the size of Bakewell, and there were about 4 youths on the roadside, and she turned round to me, did Zena, and she said, we feel such a burden for the youth of this city. Do you know that they're out late and they get drunk? And I thought, you ought to come to Sheffield sometime. But we've got this thing. We think that in the church what we're trying to do is create a room for them, and we'll let them paint it how they want, and we've got an old tennis table out, and we're going to start a youth work. So I thought, bless her. That afternoon I was doing some teaching on fresh expressions, which Stephen knows far more about than I've ever learned or forgotten. And at the end of it we drove home, and there was an eerie silence in the car. It got so bad because she was a very chatty person. This was about day 3. I said, Zena, are you all right? And she blurted out, she says, well, I was all right until you spoke this afternoon. And I was mortified because I didn't know what I said. I'm so, what have I done? She said, you've told us that our idea of youth work is no good. I said, well, I don't think I said that. What I said was, if you want a youth work, make sure you appoint somebody who's no more than 5 years different to the person that they're trying to reach. Make sure they've got a good support and some good oversight and accountability. And don't expect them to bring people into the church as you know it. And don't hold them by success or failure as to whether they do that or not. That's what I said. Well, she was still a bit quiet, and we went out and I did an evening meeting. The following morning, we're sat there, as we'd sat there 3 or 4 mornings, 3 of us round a table, and I suddenly became aware I was meant to overhear this conversation between these 2 godly, lifelong Methodist Christians who talked to one another across the breakfast table. So it went like this. Donald, aye. We've got 3 children, haven't we? I mean, that's a strange question to ask your husband of 40 years. I expected her to say, you know, just checking. But Donald, eh? She said, and if we had something that we could give to our children that they couldn't have for themselves, we'd give it to them, wouldn't we? Eh? Well, the way I see it is this church introduced us to each other. We got married here. The kids have been baptised here. One of our kids has got married here. It's been our life. But if it's not going to reach the people who we see when we go through Lerwick, and if our ideas aren't going to work, then I think we've got to act as we would for our own children, for them. I'm going to recommend to the Church Council that we do a proper youth work. And I thought to myself, in the words of Pygmalion or My Fair Lady or whatever you want to call it, by George, she's got it. And again, if you forget anything I say to you this afternoon, be aware that people who are in Christian leadership, if they're attempting to be winsome and patient and gracious, we've got churches full of people who are just longing that their children, their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren encounter means of meeting Christ and being included in a Christian community like they were. And actually, far from being selfish, when they're given a vision of how that might become, they'll move heaven and earth to try and make that work. I'm not getting very far with me 40 minutes, am I? Let's move on. The Great Commission begins go. It's another dynamic word and a challenge for most of our processes, which are usually related to inviting people to come. As one of my US friends puts it, how is it that a go-to faith has produced a come-to church? And we might note that Jesus is not recorded as saying, you go build my church and I'll go make some disciples. Jesus is recorded as saying, you go make some disciples, I will build my church. And for a long time we associated that going had to do with overseas mission. Here was England, Christian England, fueled with the fires of both empire, the Industrial Revolution and Victorian wealth, and we sent by the thousand. And then since about the 1980s, writer after writer, including this one, has recognised that in fact we're in a cultural mission field ourselves right now without having to go very far at all. We're learning that the actual techniques is too bureaucratic. The actual insights that good missionaries brought to bear in mission fields down the centuries and around the world are the very learning points that we now need to occupy the space down our streets, the neighbourhoods where we minister. So making disciples is essentially about lessening distance. Disciples aren't made through megaphones. I love a quote from Penny Jameson, who's an Anglican bishop in New Zealand, because it's so gentle, but it's so true. She wrote this: the past was strong enough for the parishioners to feel sufficient security in one another's company and each other's commitment, so that they could afford not to notice that their services were now enabling the worship of fewer and fewer people. Now, there are some good practice guides about lessening distance, but they enable us to leave our comfort zones and travel, whether it's a geographical distance, it's certainly a cultural distance. I give you some, and though none of it will be new to you. Disciples are made when we begin to realise from our part that being comes before doing, though doing isn't particularly optional. Pardon this crude illustration, but it's born of experience. What you see is as important as what you hear, which is why when you're unfortunate enough to be in hospital, the nurses pull a curtain round your bed rather than give everybody else in the ward earplugs. Think about it. Being honest is as important as being holy. We know from all sorts of studies that the apparent and sometimes the imputed perfectionism of the Christian church, that somehow we've got it, and in order to join us you need to get it too and be like us, is absolutely death to a vast majority of contemporary people. for two reasons. One is they don't believe us, and the second is they've got all sorts of good reasons not to believe us. Being human is as important as being Christian. One of my good friends, who's an international evangelist, always tells this when he speaks. I was such a good evangelist then that after 6 months, nobody would ride with me in the van. Being vulnerable is as important as being strong. Previously, the idea of calling people to disciples, I mean, just think of Chariots of Fire, great film. This muscular discipleship thing. Whereas now, more and more contemporary people, you lessen distance if you don't come across as the muscular macho Christianity, but just sort of say, you know, I'm a 2 Corinthians chapter 4 person, a cracked vessel, out of which is leaking all over the place, all sorts of things, but is also bearing testimony to the transforming and strengthening power of God. Being real is better than always being right. I've won many an argument and lost many a friend. And graciousness and faith certainty. And faith certainty is different to other kinds of certainty. Faith certainty rather than arrogance, proposing Jesus for somebody rather than imposing him, is a much better model than the old dominant forms of attempted Christianization. I love this quote from David Augsburger. Being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person they're indistinguishable. There are other good practices about discipleship, and again, you know them all. I'm using some here by an American Methodist who's a friend of mine, Robert Snazy, but he's only recasting things in slightly different language that you can read in 2,000 books. Radical hospitality. My friend Clive Marsh, a theologian, says, until churches realise that for a contemporary population there will be refuelling stops for 99 times out of 100 and get used to the idea that they're going to be taken for granted, they will not move on. I always remember an overheard conversation in a Shipley Methodist church by Olive, now gone to glory, where she went back to the kitchen with some empty green cups and saucers. And I heard her say to Ethel, her bosom pal, nobody else could get in the kitchen when Olive and Ethel were about, that new family, they've eaten all the chocolate biscuits. And then Ethel, well, we won't put them out next week. I know it's strange, it's Methodism, you're a lot different. Passionate worship. The notion of gathering and dispersing. I don't say a lot about worship, and people have criticised some of what I've written for that. It's not because I denigrate worship. I think some of it is a tiredness, because I did my PhD about worship 30 years ago, and I sort of did it and then got led on to mission and evangelism, and don't always make the leap backwards. I do appreciate the core function of worship for a Christian church. What is the chief end of man? But what the fathers and what the best leaders of the Christian church in Christian history know is that there's always a balance between the energy which is created from gathering together for worship and being blessed in worship with each other as the people of God, the Church of Christ, and then taking that energy to wherever you are and whoever you are and whatever you're doing, and then finding there the nitty-gritty of the business of life which energizes you and impels you to come back and renew your worship. And the problem with discipleship light is that it only now works one of the sides of the equation. It's all about gathering and gathering and gathering, and it's not about the interplay between feeding in the energy and the knowledge and the sheer awfulness of the rest of life and bringing it back and dispersing it and bringing it back. And that's why, or at least one of the chief reasons why, a middle son of a Methodist preacher holds all the right doctrines, gives his life to very good, proper things, and doesn't understand a bit of what we do on a service on a Sunday morning. Or it's just because his dad's failed. There's intentional faith development. I'll say a little bit more about this, but small groups and facilitating others to take leadership is one of the very few reproducible worldwide down the centuries views of developing discipleship. John Wesley didn't invent it. It was invented in the New Testament. It's evident by Acts 2:42. Risk-taking mission and service. When was the last time that our churches really engaged in risky mission and risky service? We're pretty safe for a group of people that believe in trusting the Lord, trusting God. We want it all mapped out. I'm poor as anybody, you know. I'm a bureaucrat. Give me the figures. Give me the projections. When can money be paid back? At what point do you think this ministry can break even? The application forms, the tick boxes. Do they pass? No, they don't pass, but you've just sent away somebody who's had to fulfill their quota for the benefits, and so they filled it in and they didn't know how else to fill it in. Was that a person I should have interviewed? We're about, increasingly today, dirty fingernail spirituality. Gets involved, rather than kind of pristine, distant service, which has the deadly characteristic nowadays that it's nearly always perceived, if it's not intended, to be sloped. So most of the characteristic and historic mission activities of a Methodist church would be, we've got room, would you like to come and use it? So we've got a tenant and we've got a landlord. You have needs and we here have got people who can meet them. So you're the patient and we're the doctor. You get the picture. Contemporary discipleship making works more horizontally. It works with your arm round people rather than patting people on the head. And then there's extravagant generosity. People that are perceived almost idiotically as pouring themselves out without counting the cost for other people. Now there are many other lists like that indicating the characteristics or the body language of a missional congregation, a congregation which is dedicated to seriously engage with deepening discipleship. We are not lacking models. If you gave me a week, I could produce a different model written in the last 20 years, hour by hour, and so could Stephen. What we actually lack, therefore, is not the models, not the information, not the books, not the websites. What we lack is the courage and the resolve to take them seriously, to restructure ourselves around these new things. I'm going to stop in a minute and leave the last little bit, which I was going to talk to you about catechesis. But I'll miss catechesis because you're Anglicans, you know all about catechesis. But just to finish with this notion of teaching them to obey all I have commanded you. The problem with that for people like we are and people whose churches have emerged in the last 200, 300, 400 years is that once somebody tells us about teaching, we move into an Enlightenment mindset about what teaching is. When I became a Christian, well, the second time I became a Christian, and went forward in the archetypical time at a local parish church, yes, thank you guys, somebody took me aside after whatever it was had happened and gave me a little book. I wish I had shares in it. It was green and it was by Norman Warren. It was called Journey into Life. Anybody come across it? And this kindly person took me through the pages and showed me the things, and at the back gave me a piece of paper and asked me to tick 3 boxes and sign the thing. And then she looked at me with absolute earnestness, and I'm not doubting her. She said, "Now you've become a Christian." Well, I had, and I hadn't, and I had, and I hadn't, and I had, and I hadn't, and I had. I'm becoming a Christian every day. We won't get into that one. But that whole idea that you could explain the whole of the Christianity and tick 3 boxes and have that declaration made over you is absolutely archetypically Enlightenment thinking. Do you believe in the virgin birth? Yeah, but not quite as much as the resurrection. Half a mark. Discuss. That's not what Jesus probably meant when he said, teaching them to observe all I have commanded you. Jesus was a rabbi. He spent 3 years with people, which incidentally is just about as long as Augustine and Cyril, East and West, took to catechize a Christian from darkness to light, from people who knew nothing to people who could say, we take our place in the Christian community. That's how long it takes. If you go to Fowler, other people, development, human development, it seems that human beings are pretty much conditioned not to be able to change their mind at a profound level in less than 3 years. Jesus embodied for the disciples what it was, and then at the end of the day said, effectively, when you go, be like me. Observing everything I have taught you, be like me. So I finish with a haunting story of a funeral service of a Methodist lay missionary from Eastern Africa who sadly retired, and then, like it seems quite a lot of people, in an amazingly short space of time between their retirement, then contracted a terminal illness and died. His funeral service took place in a Manchester suburb where he'd retired, and some of the people from the Maasai tribe from Ethiopia and Kenya, where he'd largely been, came to the funeral service, and one woman who was a leader of a group was asked to speak, and she stood there. She was absolutely magnificent in full Maasai dress. And she said, the name of this chap, she said, he was known by everybody, Christian or not, as Mr. Jesus Christ man. Now I think that's more what Jesus means when he says, teach them everything that I have commanded you. Because in the end of the day, this Christianity thing isn't about salesmanship, it's about being free samples. And that's the nature of what it is that we're trying to get at. Let me give you a few minutes at least to come back to me or to put more rich things on the table. I believe, I've repeated this, and I will finish with it, what we're lacking is courage. There's enough knowledge, there's enough degrees, there's enough read books, there's enough internet searches in this room that if anybody else tells me, turns around and says, I need more training before I can do this, I will scream. And this is somebody who put 350 master's students in 12 years through a programme. I'm not anti-intellectual about that. What we need to do is to begin to realise that what we read and assent to and nod and say, yes, that's right, actually needs to be engaged in the way in which we operate our ministries. And that's going to cost us. It's going to make godly people misunderstand what we're about. It's going to cost us personally because we all like to be popular. But without that culture change, and without you, who? The church will continue to be largely irrelevant to increasing parts of our population. And in the end of the day, I can't sleep at night because that seems to me to be a fundamental betrayal of trust in something which is good news.